Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, this evening I am lucky enough to be joined by Mr. Oliver Heydorn, who originates from Canada, but at the moment, Oliver, you seem to be stuck in Brisbane. How has this occurred?
Well, I often come to Australia for research purposes, as there's a social credit library here that has all sorts of interesting and unique material that can't be found elsewhere in the world. And so I arrived at the end of February, I think it was February 29th. Everything seemed to be okay, but then within 2 weeks, the borders were closed. And after that, every single flight that I've had trying to go back has been canceled.
You were on the wrong side of the world at the wrong time. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Yes, that's right. So I'm still in Brisbane.
Yeah, you're surviving. Yeah. So you're how would you describe yourself? An academic / philosopher by trade?
Yes. So my first degree was in biology, but after a while, I decided that I didn't want to be spending my life looking at fruit flies. And I thought philosophy sort of raised the more interesting questions. So I switched to philosophy, did a master's in philosophy at the Franciscan University of Steubenville, and a Ph.D. in philosophy at the International Academy of Philosophy in Liechtenstein. I studied under Josef Seifert, who was my dissertation director, my Doktorvater, and he is quite well known in Catholic circles and also in certain philosophical circles. The school that I studied under specialized in realist phenomenology.
Okay, what is that? That sounds very interesting.
Okay. So realist phenomenology was a school of philosophy that originated in the early part of the 20th century under Edmund Husserl, who taught at the University of Göttingen. And I have to be very careful whenever you talk about phenomenology, because there are forms of phenomenology that are idealistic and transcendental that sort of follow the later Husserl. But the particular school that I was trained in was the realist form of phenomenology that goes back to the logical investigations, the earlier Husserl. And there were several people that their names may ring a bell for your audience. Dietrich von Hildebrand was part of the school, St. Edith Stein, Max Scheler, Adolf Reinach, and so forth. So this was the sort of the philosophical training that I received. It's completely compatible with the Philosophia Perennis, with the broad tradition, Western tradition in philosophy. And in 2002, when I was actually in Liechtenstein and working on my dissertation, I had come back home one summer to Canada, and I received in my mailbox a pamphlet or a leaflet from the Pilgrims of St. Michael. And the Pilgrims of St. Michael are a Catholic association based in the province of Quebec, which have been basically promoting Douglas social credit ideas to anyone that will listen, Catholics or non-Catholics, for many, many decades. So I read this pamphlet that they had dropped off, and it was explaining how the banks create money, that when you get a loan, the bank isn't lending someone else's money, the money of some other depositor. It actually creates the money that it lends out of nothing. And that completely blew my mind. I was not clearly or explicitly aware of the fact that the banks are trading in a commodity that they essentially monopolize and create out of nothing. That as an isolated operation doesn't cost them anything to create. And at that time I had something like $25,000 in student debt. If I repaid it, if I was going to repay it the way the bank wanted me to, it was going to cost about $8,000 additionally in interest. And I thought to myself, this seems unjust. This seems inequitable, that they've lent me $25,000, which they've created out of nothing, and I have to pay them back the $25,000 and plus $8,000 in interest. Of course, I'm not a bank, so I can't create that money out of nothing to pay them back. I have to go find a job and work very hard in order to get that money. Mm-hmm. So that was sort of my introduction to social credit. Now, social credit deals with issues that are far more fundamental than the question of usury. But that was, I think for a lot of people, that's how they get into this whole area of monetary reform. They look at banking practice, standard banking practice, and they think this seems to involve a lot of economic rent, right? It's one thing to pay somebody $10,000 to put a pool in your backyard if it's materials and labor are costing them $9,500 and you give them $500 as their profit. That seems okay, but how much would it have cost the bank really to create that money and to administer that loan over the lifetime of the loan that I had? And yet they want all this money. If I can't pay it off all up front, they want all this money. The longer, of course, you take to pay it off is the more money that they want. So there's a certain amount of economic rent taking going on there.
It must take a certain sort of person to have the courage to go after them and look into these issues, because I'd say that the average Joe on the street, you need to buy a car, you take out a car loan, you look at the terms and you go, not pretty, going to have to work pretty hard. But that the average Joe on the street, I don't think it would occur to them to look into a theory of thought that could sort of debunk the whole economy as we know it, which is essentially, you've written a book on social credits. This seems to be something you know a lot about and you're very passionate about. But can I just pause there? Can we backtrack a little bit? And can we just spend a little bit of time talking about you? So you're a Canadian native, originally from what part of Canada?
Ontario, province of Ontario.
Ontario. Yeah. And what was it like growing up? You're a Catholic as well. Growing up as a Catholic in Ontario, because I think if people were to focus on Catholics in Canada today, would I be safe in saying that it's not the most hospitable environment for devout Catholics?
That is a good question. I don't know that there's anywhere in the Western world which is currently a hospitable environment for devout Catholics. There were certain advantages in Ontario, let's say, relative to Australia, as I understand it. One was because Canada was French before it was British. When the British took over, I think it was maybe realpolitik, they thought it was prudent to offer the French certain constitutional guarantees. And one of those guarantees was the right to a Catholic education. So Catholics have constitutional educational rights in Canada.
Wow.
What that means is that we have publicly funded Catholic schools in the province of Ontario. So I was able to go to a Catholic school, both elementary school and high school, without having to pay anything out of pocket. However, because we are sort of in the wake of Vatican II, in a Novus Ordo environment, I would also say that the Catholic education I received was significantly watered down. And it was only when I was about 15 and came across a pre-Vatican II catechism written by some Jesuits that I really started to understand what the faith was all about. And I was a bit shocked and a bit miffed that what we had received in the Catholic schools is basically pablum.
Can I ask for some examples of what that was? What did your Catholicism mean to you when you were going through your education, your both primary school and elementary?
Yes, I think the general message that was given to us was, at least the impression that I was left with it, was that Catholicism or Christianity more broadly was about being nice to people. And if we were nice to people, then at the end of our days we'd go to heaven. And if you were not so nice, then there would be some other outcome.
Right.
But sort of the nuts and bolts of the faith, the nature of the sacraments, or the virtues and things like this, they were not explained. I would say for the most part, there were some exceptions, but for the most part, they were not explained in any systematic or clear manner. So I think a lot of people who would have graduated with me would have had a very foggy notion about what the faith was really all about. And so I was always practicing. My parents, we would go to church with the family every Sunday. But the exact nature of the mass of the ontological status, let's say, what the Eucharist really is. I don't think that any of those things were really clear to me until I was about 14 or 15.
Right.
When, as I said, I came across this pre-Vatican II catechism, and I said, oh, that's what it's about.
And when you had that experience, was it something you had to grapple with? I mean, were you naturally predisposed towards accepting those sorts of things, or did you ever feel like there was an internal conflict?
No, for me, it was just natural. I had always accepted whatever I had understood. It was just a question sort of filling out the details, right? So there was no conflict or no opposition or no questioning or that sort of thing. I always thought that the faith was sort of a coherent whole and was quite logical, and all the various parts sort of fit together. And yeah, when I read this catechism of this Jesuit, I thought, well, that makes complete sense. I don't know why we weren't taught this. Why, it's not that complicated. All these things should have been, communicated in a very clear, direct, systematic manner. One of the things, of course, that was not thoroughly addressed would be the church's social teaching. And so I started to acquire some knowledge about that. The Catholic Church has a history of speaking on social matters, economic matters, political matters, cultural matters, etc. Mm-hmm. And there have been innumerable encyclicals that have been produced, more particularly from the late 19th century, Leo XIII of Navarre, and continuing with Quadragesimo Anno, Pius XI, and up to JP2 with Centesimus Annus and a few others, and then Benedict XVI and so forth. So I think I was also very predisposed, I suppose you could say that I was predisposed to accept social credit because it was so much in line with Catholic social teaching as well, that it just seemed to fit like hand in glove.
Okay, it's interesting because I've heard some people refer to it as the science of Catholicism, which means that Catholicism is actually this very, very complex religion which has teachings on everything. It's all encompassing, it's holistic, it's not like an ideology that's narrow. It is everything. And it needs to be understood as that. And if you dumb it down, you're really denying yourself the ability to learn all these truths. Fast forward, social credit theory. This is your thing. What is social credit theory?
All right. So social credit, I should say, perhaps to begin with, I should say that social credit, that term, is often confused with other things. So maybe I'll start off by explaining what social credit is not, just to kind of clear the air and then go into what it actually positively is. I don't know if this is such a problem in Australia, but certainly in North America, when you talk about social credit, because it's got the word social in it, some people jump to the conclusion that you must be talking about some form of socialism. And so I would like to make it clear from the outset that social credit is the economic system that was established by the British engineer C.H. Douglas, is not only not socialistic, it's anti-socialist. And hopefully in the course of the conversation, we can explore how and why that is. The other confusion today, thanks to the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is that when you talk about social credit, a lot of people immediately start thinking about the totalitarian reward and punishment system, which was recently introduced in the last 5 years or so by the CCP, where they are basically monitoring citizens in terms of their behavior, and if they behave the way the party wants to behave, they get points. They get a
gold star.
Yes, and if they do things the party frowns on, then their social credit score decreases. The social credit that I'm talking about is much, much older, and it's got nothing to do with any form of monitoring citizens or any form of totalitarianism. In fact, you could argue that the sort of society that Douglas envisaged is the opposite of what the CCP have established, because under Douglas, the whole idea is that you decentralize power, you empower the common citizen to sanction bureaucrats, business people, etc., to sanction the aristocrats so that they can ensure that what they do is always in line with the common good. So yeah, so we've got those two confusions. We're not talking about socialism, we're not talking about Chinese social credit. Social credit is basically, you talked about Catholicism being a science. Social credit is basically the science of association, right? So at rock bottom, Douglas said that society basically exists for a certain purpose, and that is to make it easier for us to obtain certain benefits that we couldn't obtain on our own, or couldn't obtain as easily on our own, right? So there's an unearned increment of association that brings us together into society. And if we want society to fulfill that purpose in all the various dimensions of social life, economics, politics, culture, etc., then we've got to figure out what the natural law has to say about association, right? And this is very much in keeping with Catholicism, that there is a natural law, that if we want things to flourish, we've got to identify what that law is, and we have to obey it, and we have to apply it appropriately through various mechanisms. So there's a sort of a philosophical, a social philosophy involved in social credit, and then there's a political theory, which we probably won't talk about today, and then there's the economic financial theory. The bulk of social credit that people talk about is tied up with the social economic theory, so we'll probably just focus on that. If we look at the economics of social credit, Douglas basically said that the economy can be divided into two different distinct parts. We've got like the physical economy, which you could liken to the hardware of a computer. So you've got raw materials and labor and know-how, etc., tools, machinery. And then you've got sort of the superstructure, which we've imposed on that, dealing with regulations and laws, and that could be likened to a computer software. So the financial system is part of the economy's software. And what Douglas basically said was that if you want the hardware to serve the economy's purpose as optimally as possible, so that people are getting the goods and services they need to survive and flourish with the least amount of trouble and the least amount of resource consumption, human labor, then you've got to have the proper software in place. And he says, if you look at the financial software that we run our economies on is not properly designed. At least it's not designed to give us the fulfillment of the economy's true purpose.
Why is that?
Why is that? Because, well, I guess there are two major issues here. At rock bottom, the financial system we have in place, it's not designed to give us an accurate picture or to reflect the physical reality, right? Douglas, as an engineer, he's operating from this point of view that just as, a thermometer should give us an accurate reading of the body's temperature, a barometer should tell us exactly what the air pressure is, otherwise they're useless as tools. The financial system and money should provide us with an accurate picture of our physical potential to produce and also the actual flow of real production. So there are many instances, this is one example of how the financial system does not reflect reality. There are many instances where, on the one hand, we've got the labor, we've got the raw materials, we've got the machinery, we've got the know-how. And on the other hand, we have some pressing need for healthcare, or some pressing need for, depending on the country, for food, or some pressing need for roads, or
a vaccine.
And yet, that production does not occur. That production does not occur because there's no money to serve as the catalyst to make it happen, right? But Douglas says what's physically possible should be financially possible. Like if the financial system just was neutral and was designed in such a way that it just reflected our physical potential, then whenever you have those two things, you've got a need on the one hand, and you've got the resources, the physical ability to fulfill that need, then the money should just be automatically forthcoming, right? As a catalyst. And yet there are so many instances where we've got the resources and we've got the need, but production doesn't happen because according to the rules of the existing financial system, we can't get the money. Right?
Okay.
So
And can I just push on that issue, because this is really, really interesting from somebody who's not, overly familiar with thinking about these sorts of issues. Why can we not get that money? Is it as simple as corporate greed, or is as you say, is the system at its core set up to fail?
Well, I would say that the short answer to that is that the money system is designed in such a way that it is basically geared to maximizing the private benefit of the people who own or have, who are stakeholders in the banking system. So, as we were talking about before we actually started the show, when we think of money, many people, they think of notes and coins, the physical money. That is only a very small part of the money supply. And it's typically created by a government or a state body, but it's a very, very small, 5% or less of the money supply. The bulk of the money supply exists in the form of bank credit, it's not tangible, it's not physical. It's created whenever a bank makes a loan or any other purchase out of nothing. And if you have a monopoly, as the banks do, the private banking system does, on money creation, on bank credit creation, then of course it makes sense that you're going to keep that money scarce, because if you keep it scarce, you can maximize the amount of money that you can receive in exchange for it in the form of interest. So every good monopolist will try to keep their supply of whatever good they monopolize scarce. In this case, artificially scarce. What social credit is basically saying is, as far as production is concerned, the primary duty of the financial system is to reflect reality and not to enforce any kind of artificial scarcity.
So is it the banks that are imposing the problem? That sounds very direct and unfair on the banks, but is it that simple, sort of in theory?
Well, it's more complicated than that. It's always more complicated than that. But certainly the fact that they've got a monopoly, which the state has allowed them to have, and they're basically expected, or it's accepted that they will run like any other business, then they're going to look after their own interests ahead of the public interest. Mm-hmm. And Douglas was not in favor of nationalizing banks. We don't have a problem with there being private banks, but the basic idea is that because money is so central to everyone else's business, the banks have a duty, and this should be enforced by the state. They have a duty to serve the public interest first, and only to be rewarded to the extent that they effectively and efficiently and fairly serve the public interest. And the public interest is for the financial system to reflect reality. The public interest is to ensure that, again, whenever we have a need and we've got the resources, that whatever money is needed to catalyze that production will be automatically forthcoming. We can create as much money. I mean, there's no limit on the amount of money that can be created. We can create, it's as many numbers as there are we can think of. The only limit that should exist would be a limit that's inherent to the nature of things, that that corresponds basically to this conjunction of needs and resources. Obviously, you don't want to create more money than you have resources. If you've got a need and you don't have the resources, there's no purpose creating the money to catalyze the production. That would be inflationary. But as long as these two things exist, then an honest financial system, a just financial system would step up and simply facilitate that. And there's no reason for people to go without needed goods and services if the resources to provide that is in existence. Now, this is more of a problem, I would say, in developed countries than it is in developing countries, the sort of artificial limitation on productive capacity. But there's a secondary problem, which is quite a big problem in developed countries. And this is the second way in which the financial system fails to reflect reality. So Douglas said that in any existing modern productive system, because of the way the financial system is designed, and this has to do not just with the banking part of the financial system, but also cost accountancy. He said that whenever we try to produce anything under existing financial rules, the rate at which costs and prices are generated automatically exceeds the rate at which incomes are being distributed by those same productive organizations to consumers in the form of wages, salaries, and dividends. So it's as if, for every $100 that a company produces, they're only distributing, these numbers are merely illustrative, but they're only distributing, say, $50 to consumers. Well, how can you buy $100 worth of goods with $50? Right? There's an inherent imbalance in the system that's structural. The banks aren't directly responsible for that. That's an accounting flaw that's inherent to the system. And we can talk about what it is that generates this disparity in the rates of flow between costs and prices and incomes, on the other hand. But because the banks have a monopoly on credit creation, the only way of filling that gap is for somebody, let's say the government or a business or a consumer, to go to the private banks and borrow more money into existence. Right? Somebody's got to go into debt in order for the economy to have enough money so that there'll be adequate consumer purchasing power to offset the flow of costs and prices. And that causes all sorts of problems, right? That people complain about and they seem to be intractable. Each political party, whenever there's an election, they promise that they're going to solve the problem, but they're simply managing a lot of the fallout that comes from the fact that the system is, again, not giving us an accurate picture of reality. If the financial system were honest, if the financial software were designed in such a way that it provided us with an accurate picture of the real economy, whenever you have some good or service with a price tag attached that's coming on the market, the system would automatically ensure that there's enough consumer purchasing power to distribute that production to meet all the costs, and to make sure, and to do that without this requirement that people go deeper and deeper into debt.
Okay. Two questions for you just at this point in time. A while back, we were talking about the banks, and you said part and parcel of the problem may not be, the root problem, but a part of the problem is, did you say the banks artificially depicting the state of affairs? So are you suggesting that if the banks did not do that, it would be different? The problem goes deeper than just banks monopolizing and manipulating ledgers?
Yes, because this accountancy problem that we're talking about is not something that the banks are directly responsible for.
And I think you have already answered this, but I'm just hoping to sort of flesh this issue out a little further.
Yeah, so in a system, if we had a system where, the money was borrowed from the banks and all of it was converted into consumer income, and the cost of goods was no greater than the consumer income that was released, then the fact that the banks have a monopoly would not generate the same kind of problem on the consumption side of the equation that it presently generates, right? So the banks basically are taking advantage of the fact, probably not consciously, not deliberately, but it's just the way the system has evolved. They're taking advantage of the fact that there is this gap, that more money is needed, and they're monetizing the gap, which we need someone to do, but they're monetizing it on terms that suit their own interests ahead of the public interests. And this is one of the ways in which wealth, power, and privilege become centralized in fewer and fewer hands. Okay? So what Douglas proposed is, why don't you just have an organ of the state monetize the gap and distribute it to the consumer on his behalf, right? And this would basically ensure that the financial system would become an honest system, that it would reflect the reality that whenever we register that there are certain costs, well, we've got the income in consumer pockets to cover those costs without having to go back to the banks and borrow more money into existence. One of the ways of distributing that money to consumers was in the form of a national dividend. So that is sort of like a basic income, but there are also important differences. Everyone would receive, let's say every month, a payment, could be, let's say, $1,500. I'm just pulling that number out of thin air, but that's sort of a reasonable starting point. And it would be independent of their employment status. So regardless of whether people are working or not, everyone would be guaranteed their portion of the dividend, whatever that happens to be. And it would fluctuate depending on the size of the price income gap. Okay. Have you heard of the universal basic income?
I have.
Right. So That's similar in the sense that, yeah, people are getting an income regardless of whether they're working for it or not. The difference is that a universal basic income, as it's typically conceived, is not built on this platform of monetary reform, right? It's working within the existing system. So if you're going to give people a universal basic income, well, it's got to come through redistributive taxation or an increase in public indebtedness. And what Douglas is saying is we can actually provide people with something like a UBI if we change the financial system and we monetize the gap with a sufficient flow of debt-free credit. And as I say, that would depend on the size of the gap. So the dividend is indexed to productivity. It's not a guaranteed amount, whereas the universal basic income, as it's conventionally often conceived, is a sort of a fixed amount that everyone would get, and the state would just sort of ensure that that money is distributed. Also, one of the objections that people raise whenever you talk about a national dividend or a basic income, they will say, well, if you gave people an income independent of work, a certain percentage of the population would maybe they'd refuse to work or they'd stop working. And I guess there are two things I would say about that from a social credit perspective. One is, and this may shock some of your listeners or viewers, I don't know, but actually we don't need everybody working. That in the modern economy with technology, and this will only increase as we have automation, things like this, we're able to produce more and more or better with fewer and fewer people working. And in that context, a policy of full employment makes absolutely no sense. Right? It's not efficient. We should have a policy of the minimum employment necessary, getting things done with the least amount of effort. So, it's if we introduce a national dividend and some jobs go by the wayside, well, that's probably not such a scandalous thing, because a lot of jobs exist today only to distribute income. It's not that they're make work in one form or another. They're witless, useless, redundant, and or destructive. It's just because we have this idea that everyone's got to work, even though their work is not necessarily required for the real flow of goods and services that answer to human needs. But the other thing I would say is that whereas, with the UBI, it's a guaranteed amount, and they don't really have any provision for, if too many people decide to stop working. Because the social credit dividend is indexed to productivity, if too many people decide that they're not going to work and the flow of the needed goods and services, the goods and services we actually want, starts to diminish, well, the dividend will diminish. And that sort of serves as a feedback mechanism, an indication that more labor is therefore required.
Okay. The second question, I didn't mean to cut you off there. The second question I was going to ask is, this is just going back to, I think, that the basis of the problem you were describing, this, the amount of resources available and the need, the money should facilitate that in a very efficient way at a big level. Okay. But then when you sort of break it down to a micro level, individuals, how do you determine which individuals have that money? Is this when the idea of the basic dividend comes in? Yeah. So how would you divide that money amongst the populace?
Well, the national dividend would be an equal amount. It would be divided into equal shares for every citizen. So the idea is that we're all shareholders in society. If you think of Australia as a business, call it Australia Limited, then all Australian citizens are rightly regarded as shareholders in their society. And if that society produces a profit, which it does, that is to say, if you look at the whole volume of production that comes on the market in a year, if that exceeds the amount of income that's being distributed, well, you can monetize that gap and regard it as a profit and distribute it to the shareholders as their rightful share as shareholders in society and heirs to society's cultural heritage. That is their proper share in the societal profit. Now, if you do that, obviously you're giving basically money votes to people, and they can decide then where they want to spend it. And depending on their decisions, the producers will have to respond to, just as it happens now, they'll have to respond to where the demand is. And as they respond, if there's more demand for something, well, then they will be in a position to go to their banks or other investors and acquire more money to expand production.
And when you say that the idea is to free up work, and referring to the idea as every citizen is a shareholder, well, the idea of shareholders, isn't it, is that you've actually got skin in the game. So you've bought shares in the company, you've given something up, and therefore you're entitled to receive something in return. Is the premise that you are entitled to this dividend by virtue of being a citizen of that country?
Yes, because you're basically regarded as an heir. You're basically regarded as an heir. So past organizers, scientists, engineers, etc., have made the tremendous productive capacity of modern society possible. They're dead. So they're not in a position to benefit from their discoveries, inventions, etc. And we, living now, are the heirs of that cultural inheritance. They've bequeathed it to us. And just as a child from a well-to-do family may be given shares, and when we don't object to that, well, the whole idea is that there's a real basis, and the economy needs the money. The economy needs extra money. There's a real basis for regarding everyone, as every citizen, as an heir and a shareholder on that basis.
Okay, where's the incentive to flourish?
The incentive to flourish exists. It's the same as it is now. If you're not happy, let's say, with the dividend, if that's not giving you enough purchasing power to acquire the things you need, well, we'll still need people to work, right? There'll still be people employed in various positions, earning a salary or a wage. And even if their work is not required in the formal economy, under social credit, there would be an opportunity for people to exchange goods or services on a community basis as well. So there's still, the dividend, we anticipate it would be enough to meet people's basic needs, but if people have aspirations, the same incentives that exist now would continue to exist.
Okay. And the other point I thought was very, very interesting was your point that it's not necessary to have everybody out working. Tell you what, there's a part of that I find very, very refreshing, because there seems to be an attitude in the corporate world anyway, where you're really judged as an individual based on the amount of effort you put in during the week. 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. 24 hours. But there is another element to work rather than just giving back and contributing to the economy. There's a social element. They refer to with gainful employment, reduced crime, people keeping busy. I'm not for a second suggesting that people have to be tied to the work mill to maintain some sort of civilized society. But do you think would it be stretching it to suggest that we should sort of have this laissez-faire attitude towards work, and where this enlightened people, who we can all sit back reliant on this national dividend, knowing that we're going to get our check in the mail? I'm just imagining different cultures may take that different ways. Australians are very laid back, so you could have 22 million people sitting back on the couch with a stubby, getting their waiting for their check, whereas the Americans or something, working really, really hard all the time and making it rain. What sort of factors would people like yourselves take into account when determining what effect that could have on a scale larger than just the economic one?
Yeah. Well, when it comes to sort of introducing a national dividend, the social credit measures, I don't think it's something that could be done overnight. I think it's something that would have to occur over time. I think there would have to be a change in the educational system. People would have to be educated not for a job to follow instructions as they are now, but they would have to be educated to spend their leisure time profitably. There would have to be a cultural change. But I think this is completely doable. In medieval England, in the high medieval period, let's say right before the Reformation, it's been reported by historians that the average peasant in England only had to work 15 weeks of the year. And they also enjoyed 150 official holidays, church holidays in the year. And yet the sky didn't fall. Society did not fall apart. In fact, this was a period when there was tremendous advances and both in the arts and the sciences. This is the time when the cathedrals were built and so on and so forth, sometimes taking hundreds of years, and people did that very often voluntarily. So,
this is a genuine question. Would the peasants have been the beneficiaries of those advances in science and literature at the time?
Well, I think they were, because at least at that particular part of the Middle Ages, you had people participating in theater. Because they didn't have television, they didn't have all these other things. There was a lot of homegrown folk culture and high culture, right? And people had the time and the energy and the wherewithal to do that because they didn't have this sort of puritanical work ethic, which is something that really comes out of Calvinism, right? So on a very practical level, I think that this transition, this cultural transition, is something that we're going to be forced to deal with, because you have a lot of people now, futurists, by no means social creditors. I mean, they probably know nothing about the social credit tradition, but they are predicting that within 20 years, let's say 50% of existing American jobs will be automated. Mm-hmm. So, we can see where things are going. I mean, as things stand now, generally, if I go to the supermarket, I'm the one doing the checkout, me and a machine, right?
Yeah.
And we can only imagine that as technology improves, that is just the direction that we're moving in.
Mm. So you just notice the difference in rubbish collection between Australia and America. Over in America, you've got, I think it's teams of two. You've got one gentleman driving the truck and then the other gentleman running behind, picking up the trash. And out here, all it takes is one. And you go, that's a job. And you extrapolate that across all the different garbage pickup trucks. And it's a trite example, but look at the number of jobs, purely because you've got this, piece of machinery that can, in the name of efficiency. So, some people may roll their eyes and go, what a ridiculous thing to actually take the time to think about. But, is part of does the social credit idea take into account that people need to be productive to flourish?
Well, it depends what you mean by productive. I think the problem with our modern society is that productive means going to work 9 to 5 and generally working for somebody else in some corporate structure. Mm. And, we're not against, Douglas, he said quite clearly, when we're talking about leisure, we're not talking about idleness, right? Leisure means that you have the time, the resources, the money to determine for yourself how you're going to profitably spend your time. So, we talk about work, what are we talking about? I think things have become so perverted in sort of the modern society that if you think about work, you think about paid employment. But a mother who is cooking a meal for her family, that's work. Or someone who is volunteering in the community, that's work. Right? Someone who is painting or creating sculpture, creating music, that is a type of work. Right? So there are all sorts of things, meaningful things that people can do. And I do think people do have a need to spend their time profitably, but there are all sorts of meaningful things that people can do outside of the formal economy.
Okay, very interesting. What I'd like you to do then is paint a picture. Take a little village, an enclave. No name. We don't know where it is, but what would that establishment, that township, look like if it operated under Douglas social credit here?
Yeah, all right. So if people had a national dividend, and if there wasn't this pressure to find gainful employment, and we didn't have all these artificial financial pressures, I think that people would be a lot less stressed. I think that the fact that they're less stressed would mean that the healthcare system would be less stressed and less cash strapped. Not that cash would be the same problem that it is in the social credit society anyway. I think that people would have more time to meet others, to form community, to determine what actually their true interests and passions are, and to develop those things.
Would there still be demand for industry? And when I say industry, I'm not talking about it in the capitalist sense, but that driving force that brings along advances in medicine, science, philosophy, literature, flourishing.
Well, I would say that the more leisure people have, the types of people you're talking about, the more leisure inventors have, the more leisure scientists have, the more leisure philosophers have, the better they are in a position to advance society. Many of our greatest inventions and advances have come from people who had time to tinker. And those sorts of people, the sorts of people that do discover things, they're just wired that way. They're going to tinker. So I would argue that if you give people economic security, a certain basic degree, minimum degree of economic security and independence, those people who are inclined that way would be in a far better position to follow their passions, to follow their hearts, and so forth. And in fact, I think this would liberate even more the rate at which discoveries and advances are made.
Okay.
Because
continue.
Speaking from my own experience, I've written 4 books on social credit, but if I wasn't so hamstringed by financial concerns, they might have been 40.
I love it. Right. I can't profess as to how productive I would have been if I had more time on my hands. I'll dream about it. Part of the social credit theory, am I correct in saying that it involves some sort of government oversight to ensure that this operates correctly?
Yes.
Now, is there a risk, given, take something as simple as the Catholic idea of original sin, that could, by necessity, fall into socialism?
Fall into socialism how?
Government manipulation. So while it's, in theory, the idea that the government pays the dividend, government manipulation of power.
Yeah. Okay. So the organ that Douglas proposed to sort of oversee the dividend, and another mechanism that he proposed called the compensated price, it's supposed to be like a state organ, like you could say a bureau of weights and measures. It's a state organ that is independent of, let's say, the political party in power in a liberal democracy, and would not be something that politicians would be in a position to make decisions about, right? Just as the post office or a bureau of weights and measures has certain tasks that are set for it, and they're making public all the information that upon which they make their decisions. The National Credit Authority is supposed to operate on the same sort of basis. So no politician could come into power and tell the National Credit Authority, oh, no, we don't want you to give money to people as dividends. We want to spend it on some social program instead. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That separation of powers, and as long as it's set up properly, you've got the rule of law, then you insulate it.
Okay, understood. What does social credit look like today? So for our purposes, I'm finding this absolutely fascinating because I'm talking about something that I'm not exposed to on a day-to-day basis. And I think I alluded to earlier, whether it was at the start of the show or before we went live, if you went to a party and you'd find these sophisticated people drinking cognac in the corner, and, it's just not something that you hear an awful lot about. So what is the status of it today? And what is the big picture idea from people who thoroughly believe in it, like yourself?
I think if you talk to most social creditors, and you're correct, there aren't that many of them about because not so many people know about this. There was a time in Canada where we actually had social credit governments. There was a social credit government elected in Alberta in the 30s, and there was also a social credit government in British Columbia, provincially. They held power for many, many decades. Neither of those governments was in a position to implement any of the social credit reforms, because whenever Alberta tried, they were told that, no, you're a provincial government, you don't have jurisdiction over banking. So that whole history, it was quite a force in the Commonwealth at one time. It's sort of been sent down the Orwellian memory hole. So there aren't that many social creditors around today. However, there are two big things on the horizon which are promising from a social credit perspective, where it's sort of forcing society to either choose the social credit solution or to choose maybe something like Chinese social credit, or something that is more totalitarian and not respectful of the human person. So we're sort of coming to the crossroads, and those two things, I've mentioned one of them before. Whether we like it or not, as time moves on, we are displacing more and more people from jobs because technology can do it better. Right? So if in 20 years, 50% of American jobs are automated, those people who are without jobs, what are they going to do? I would argue that as it stands, a good proportion of jobs, perhaps even the majority of existing jobs, are to a greater or lesser extent witless, useless, redundant, and or destructive. It's just make work, especially if you think of bureaucracy, government bureaucracy. But even in the private sector sometimes, you've got people who are crossing T's and dotting I's, and this is somehow deemed important. Because they have to have a job. They got to be productive, right? Whereas I think a lot of those people would be better off at home tending their gardens or looking after their families. They'd actually be making a greater contribution to the common good.
Right. But is it central to this idea that when you're not working, you are a productive member of society. You're not out breaking in, domestic violence, beating your wife. So it's not just an economic theory. It's a true social theory.
Yes, right. That's right. That's fair enough to say. Yeah. So we have this looming sort of Armageddon of technology and what's going to become of people's jobs, which is going to force society to adapt. Right? Are we going to establish a society, which is what apparently some of the modern monetary theory people want, where the government becomes the employer of last resort? Right? So you've got, I don't know if you've heard of modern monetary theory, but this seems to be...
I've heard of it. Is this, let me try this. This is where, for an example, you can be in trillions of dollars of debt, and then you can just take a pencil and strike through it. Sort of.
Like they say that it doesn't really matter what the national debt is, because
just a number.
It's just a number. The government's never going to go bankrupt. We can always create more. It's shouldn't be a limitation. But they have this idea, a lot of them anyway, that the government should be the employer of last resort. That there should be a federally based job guarantee. So with increasing automation, this looming Armageddon, if you look at it as a negative thing of increasing automation, that's coming down the pipe, and you're a modern monetary theorist will say, well, the government will just employ people, right? All those people that are displaced by work, we'll just let the government employ them doing something that is socially useful. Now, you can imagine, given the current social, cultural, political atmosphere, what some of those socially useful jobs might be, right? They might employ people as COVID enforcement officers, or dare I say, in certain circles, as drag queen storytellers at libraries. Some people are, whoever the political party is that's in power, will say, well, these are socially useful jobs, and we'll employ people doing this and this and this.
So you're putting the government in charge of society.
Yes, and whereas social credit says it's not a problem. We'll just give people the money that they need and that the economy needs to achieve equilibrium, and we will allow them the freedom to decide for themselves how properly to use their time. We don't need to have the government step in as the employer of last resort and tell people what to do. So that's, as I say, this is sort of like, we're going to be forced to choose. Are we going to go the social credit way and give people leisure, increasing leisure? or we'll go the MMT, federal job guarantee way. And basically, if you can imagine the private sector shrinking and shrinking and shrinking as technology displaces labor, then the public sector will grow and grow and grow. And you basically may end up with a communist society where most people are employed by the government doing, building pyramids or whatever the government thinks we should be doing. So there's that aspect of the problem. So we see this as hopeful. We don't see increasing automation as Armageddon. We see it as a marvelous opportunity to advance civilization to the next stage, potentially. I mean, there are a lot of things that need to come to make that happen. It's just not an economic change. Like I mentioned before, there'd have to be a cultural change, an educational change, so on and so forth. And that would be something that would have to take time, given that human nature needs time to adapt. And old habits will take time to sort of die away and be replaced by new ones. The other sort of looming problem is just the financial system and how stable it is, right? We've seen with COVID that we were entering in a period of volatility and instability. And on the social credit analysis, financial crises are inevitable as long as we run the economy on the existing financial software.
When you say stable, do you mean the amount of faith that everybody has in it, or it's accepted as the status quo? It's not stable in terms of not being prone to disaster.
It's not stable in the sense that regardless of whether people have faith in it or not, it's designed in such a way that it will periodically collapse, right? Because what happens is, since we've got this debt money system, we rely on debt for to get more money into the economy. There come times when there's just too much debt and we can't service the debt, and so the only way to reboot the system is to basically allow people, businesses, etc., to go bankrupt, and then we can clean the slate and start again. So social credit says if we could stabilize the economy by creating enough debt-free credit so that we balance the flow of prices with the flow of incomes, and we're not relying on all this debt, then we can get rid of inflation, we can get rid of economic instability. And as labor is displaced by machinery, there's the physical effect of that, people being thrown out of work, but there's also the financial effect. It becomes more and more difficult to fill the gap that is created with debt money. So we're headed, whether we like it or not, we're headed to this sort of point where we have to make a massive shift, a paradigm shift in one direction or another. And I think if people are concerned about socialism or a loss of individual freedom, it's quite clear that the choice has to be the social credit path rather than, let's say, the MMT path.
And do you think the social credit theory is a theory that will be seriously considered if people considered they were at those crossroads?
Yes, I think so. It's just a matter of getting the information out there to enough people where it actually becomes discussed.
Right.
So one of the things that I've been working on recently is a series of animated videos. Each of them is only 3 to 4 minutes, and it explains some aspect of the social credit theory.
I have watched it, and I've enjoyed them.
You've watched them all, have you?
I've watched 4 or 5. I'm not sure how many there are, but that many.
Okay, good. So, I'm doing my little part to ensure that when the crisis does hit, hopefully there will be many other people out there that know that there is an alternative, and that the way in which our oligarchic elites may want to push us is not the only way we can go, that there's an alternative.
Okay. So what's next for you, Oliver? You're stuck in Australia at the moment. You can't get back overseas. I'm sure you're madly working on a book. So bearing in mind you're this crusader for the social credit theory, something you very much believe in. What does the future hold for you?
Well, we're going to try and do some more animations because in this first batch we've done, I think, 14. There'll be 14 in all. They're not all released yet. But once that's completed, there are many other aspects of social credit, just the economics that we haven't yet exhausted. So we'll be talking about social credit and inflation, because one of the objections that is often raised against the social credit proposals is that, oh, if you had an organ of the state create money debt-free, then it would be inflationary. And that is not necessarily the case. And Douglas has his explanation for why the measures would not or need not be inflationary. So there are all sorts of other aspects of the social credit analysis and proposals which can be explored that way. And I think it's worthwhile to continue with the animation project, because a lot of people are probably not going to be inclined just off the bat to pick up, let's say, my 500-page social and read it, right? So you have to kind of find a way to whet the appetite and to draw them in. And I think the animations are a way of doing that. So that's at the present time anyway. So much is visual, so much is online, so much is through the internet. That seems the best way at the moment of getting the information out there. And once they know about it and they've thought about it, then they can proceed and read articles and books and that sort of thing.
I enjoyed them very much. They were very simple, and they made it both palatable and digestible. So what sort of foothold do ideas like this have nationally, internationally? So are you the only social credit theorist in Australia right now?
There are other people who write on social credit topics. So I wouldn't, in Australia, so I wouldn't say that I'm the only social credit theorist in Australia at the moment. But there would be a handful of people. So, there are not that many of us. We're basically sort of keeping the ideas alive and trying to transmit them to newcomers. In Canada, there are probably a few more. There's one academic, actually there are a couple of academics in the UK that work on social credit. And so there aren't that many of us, but I suppose it's quality, quantity, and it's always David against Goliath. I should mention, before we sort of bring things to a close, I should mention that from a Catholic perspective, it's very interesting that the only act of violence that is recorded in Jesus's public ministry, or even in his whole life, is when he overturned the table. Money changers in the temple, and St. Paul says that the love of money is the root of all evil. I mean, there's a lot of powerful stuff in the New Testament condemning the sort of worship of mammon that our economy is essentially based on. So the idea is that the financial system we have in place, because it makes money a scarce commodity, and because the monopoly that controls it has you doing its will in order to get some of that money, you have a system that's literally dedicated to the worship of mammon. I mean, it is the religion of the West. It's a pagan religion. You can imagine who's ultimately behind it. But the very structure of society, because the financial system is so dominating, it actually creates a social structure that orbits around money. The love of money is the root of all evil. People, Catholics in particular, are concerned about things like abortion or the legalization of same-sex marriage, or drag queen story hour or pedophilia or whatever. From a social credit perspective, a Catholic social credit perspective, as long as you have a system that incarnates the worship of mammon as ours does, and you don't have a Christian financial system, right, which should be something radically different, you're never going to be able to counteract all these incoming missiles, because you haven't taken out the missile launcher. Yeah? And what I'm saying, I'm just sort of scratching the surface. There's so much that could be said about this. When it came to the legalization of same-sex marriage in Australia, as I understand it, the yes side was outfinanced, or was outfinancing the no side something to like 100 to 1.
Possibly, and it sounds probable.
Yeah. So when the money power is against you and is calling the shots in society, all you can do is rearguard actions.
I'm personally not convinced that it was a financial war, even though I think that what you're saying is correct. I think the powers have just done a fairly good job of eroding traditional values to the core. That is a very interesting thought. Are there any modern day economies that implement something that remotely resembles a social credit theory?
Good question. Let's see. I don't think so. There have been times and places when some aspect of it has been introduced, like, although it's usually sort of twisted or inverted somehow. The Japanese, prior to the Second World War, were implementing certain aspects of Douglas's ideas, but they were doing it to subsidize their export markets, which is not what Douglas intended. So there are things like that have gone on, but there's nothing that I'm aware of at the moment. You've got certain like small scale or local attempts at implementing something social credit-like in Madagascar or certain other African countries, but nothing at a national level that I'm aware of.
Right. Well, that just means you and your band of social credit warriors have a lot of work to do.
Did you say that word, work?
Well picked up. Well picked up. A lot of deep contemplative thought and consequential action. We'll put it that way. Oliver, it's been so fun. Very, very interesting. I've learned a lot from our chat. Thank you so much for joining me in the lounge room, and fingers crossed we'll have more to talk about in the future.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it as well.